favour, well short of the 4 states the Yes campaign needs. I spoke earlier to Indigenous Liberal Senator and Shadow Minister for Child Protection, Karen Little, where she reacted to these latest numbers.
Well, certainly the conversations that I have with everyday Australians all over Australia when I travel tell me that they've been convinced that they're going to vote no for quite some time. So, I mean, the polls are telling us, and quite a number of polls, that the trajectory is going in the wrong direction for the Yes campaign. And that's because we're still at the point where we've got the writs issued, don't have a level of detail for this proposition that I think is necessary when you're asking people to change the Constitution.
We see in South Australia, and that's what most people are considering will be a crucial state in this referendum, a poll this week that had no well in front in South Australia. Is that the impression you're getting there? And is it just that lack of detail that you think people are concerned about, or are there other reasons that people have reservations about this proposal?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons why people would say no, and that applies to me. The principle of putting in the Constitution something that is divisive doesn't wash with me. But there are many other reasons, and I guess in South Australia, we had the state government, the Labor state government in South Australia, rush out to get a South Australian voice legislated because it wanted to show people the way, it wanted to show people how this would work. And yet what we have now is we see that parked until after this referendum. So I think they've got nothing to show for all of the time and investment they've spent on creating a legislated voice in South Australia. And I think South Australians have been watching that. And again, there's nothing to show. Can I also say that I think in South Australia, we've also got, a lot of people in a geographically defined area that is metropolitan South Australia. And I think it is true that people in communities from, Ceduna, from the APY lands, from the Riverland ring me and say, we're Aboriginal people. They tell me their stories. Some of them are people I've not met before, and they say, we're voting no. We're not convinced that this $300 million exercise for a referendum is going to result, given we're talking about a simple advisory body, as the Prime Minister calls it, is going to result in any greater change for us than the many working groups, the many committees, the many engagement commissioners, the many commissioners that we have already.
So if the voice is not the answer to addressing some of the issues that we see, particularly in remote Aboriginal communities, what is the solution for turning around some of those shocking statistics that we see from those places?
I think one thing's really clear. Everybody wants better outcomes for Indigenous Australians, and I've always been big on accountability. Before coming into Parliament about 15 months ago, my work was in engaging people in employment, in training, in education, and a lot of those people came from disadvantaged backgrounds. That's what's important to me, is really focusing on economic and employment participation for people. I think that accountability is a key thing. In the last couple of months, and even the last sitting, we've put up a proposition to actually look more closely at the land councils and other organisations that are supposed to deliver intergenerational benefit. They're supposed to deliver improvement in the lives. And I'm not just talking about land councils, I'm talking about not-for-profits, I'm talking about Aboriginal community controlled. Now, we asked for a closer examination of those organisations to understand who's doing a good job and who's not, and why not, and the greater accountability we can put on those organisations, because they can make a difference right now. If the Prime Minister was so committed to this voice proposition, he could have legislated it. But instead, in the last couple of weeks, what we've heard is, although we've heard all of these conversations about this is the right way, this is our one chance, what we've also heard from him is he's going to abandon that if the vote is a no vote. I mean, that tells me he doesn't believe in the principle of actually engaging people in matters that affect them, but that's another issue entirely. I don't believe that that's true, that people aren't already consulted on matters that affect them. We have, as I mentioned before, a plethora of commissioners, a plethora of working groups that provide advice, and usually they're people who have specialist advice to a range of not just the service providers, but also to government. I think the issue is, how do we make sure there's greater accountability of those organisations so that the money that comes from Canberra that's delivered to the states and territories is actually spent in the way it's intended and to greatest effect? And I think the to greatest effect is one of the biggest issues we have to confront. We have to start some truth-telling about those organisations that can, should do a lot better.
Can I just ask you about some comments that have been made and reported this week, made by Marcia Langton, who is a significant supporter, a prominent supporter of the Yes campaign and the co-author of the report that was commissioned by the former coalition government. We know about the comments that she made in Bunbury that were reported by the Bunbury Herald, where she was accusing no campaigners of being racist and stupid, and subsequently some comments that have been reported by our own Andrew Clennell here at Sky News, a UQ event in July where she said that no supporters and campaigners were spewing racism, and she's accused Peter Dutton, your leader, of appealing to the coalition's racist base with its no campaigning. What's your response to some of those comments?
Well, I think that ignores entirely the reasonable reason why people would say no to this proposition. This isn't the first time we've heard some language from people who actually sit on the referendum working group, you know, resourced by taxpayers. So I think the Prime Minister himself has some questions to answer in terms of how people conduct themselves as we're having this conversation. You know, I can stand by what I've done and what I've said in these conversations, and I would encourage everybody to be respectful. But you don't hear a lot of apologies from people when they might say something in the heat of the moment. They might say something that's unreasonable, saying, yeah, probably pretty ordinary, I should have probably pulled back, it wasn't the right thing to say, or it was just plain wrong. But we don't hear that enough from them, and I think when you're sitting on working groups that are resourced by the taxpayer, there is even a higher level of expectation on you than somebody who's a random and says, well, no, and gives a reason for saying no. So I'm disappointed, obviously, in comments that don't argue for the value of the Yes campaign argument, because I don't believe there really is one. You know, spending over $300 million on a referendum where the polls are telling us we're barely 50%, I just think is probably not the way I would have encouraged money to be spent, when that money and the money that the philanthropics have thrown at this feel-good vibe could have been used to directly support those people, the most vulnerable people in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, in programs for them that would directly affect them.
Can I ask you just specifically about some other comments that are being reported that Marcia Langton made back in 2020? And one of them, she says, and this is an area, these are both areas where I think you have some knowledge and experience. One, she says, families have been broken apart by social workers who are by and large white and racist. And she's also been quoted as saying that police are racist and that they get brownie points for rounding people up. What do you make of those comments?
Well, if I was in a room and she was making those comments, I would ask her to give me examples. Where has this actually happened? Is this just a blanket statement and you're trying to capture every single incident that ever occurred and put a broad brush over a whole sector? I do think there has to be greater accountability across a whole range of sectors, but you don't get that by abusing people about how they're working and what they're doing. You actually work out what's going wrong, hence why we've asked for an inquiry, and actually start unpacking it from the inside, because they're the organisations that actually are the true power in actually getting the change that we want. This idea that somehow change will just come because the parliament or the government says so is quite frankly, I think, a nonsense in that it is those organisations that deliver the services that actually can really make the difference, because they're working with people, the most vulnerable people, every day. And a good example is you look at National Indigenous Affairs Agency. That funds over 1,000 programs to external providers every year. So we have to ask, so let's put greater accountability on NIAA. Let's put greater accountability on also those organisations. And let's start asking the people who are affected by those programs the most what they think of those programs. That's what's critically important here. Hearing the voices that are most important to be heard, not because they're loudest, not because they're the most resourced, and not because they're good at reading and writing, but because they should be heard in these discussions. And I think that's where this gets forgotten. I look at some of those images of people that are standing up there talking about supporting voice, and many of those people are actually from those very organisations that are funded by the Commonwealth Government or the states and territories. They're standing up there and saying, yes. Well, I think you'd have to be pretty courageous or looking for a new job if your organisation that you work for says, we're voting yes, we're supporting yes, and you're saying, well, maybe not.